The rain fell like nails on the rusted metal roof of the barn outside Bastogne. December 1944. The cold bit through wool and leather, through skin, straight into bone. I knelt beside Miller in the dark, my hands pressed against his chest, feeling the warm blood seep between my fingers. His breath came in shallow, broken gasps, the kind that sound like questions. "Tell me about home," he whispered. I couldn't look at his face. "Not yet. You're going to tell them yourself," I said, pressing harder, though we both knew it wouldn't matter. He smiled. I felt it more than saw it. The shadows in that barn were thick as grief, broken only by the distant flash of artillery lighting up the frost on the window. Somewhere outside, the 101st Airborne was holding the line. Somewhere outside, men were dying in foxholes they dug with frozen fingers. But in that moment, the war had shrunk to the size of a single breath. His breath. "You promised," Miller said, his voice fading into the sound of rain. "I had. 2 weeks earlier, in a trench near the Siegfried line, when the mortars screamed overhead and we pressed our faces into the mud like it could save us. I had looked him in the eye and said, 'We're both getting home. I promise.' Now his hand gripped my wrist, weak, trembling. 'Tell Sarah I loved her,' he said. 'Tell her I tried, Miller. Tell her.' His grip loosened. His chest stopped rising. The rain didn't stop. The war didn't stop. But something in me did. That was the last time I spoke to him. And the first time I understood what silence sounds like when it takes someone you love. I didn't cry. Not then. There wasn't time. Sergeant Kovac kicked open the barn door, his silhouette backlit by the pale glow of snow and smoke. 'We're moving,' he barked. 'Germans are pushing through the woods. We hold or we die.' I stood slowly, my hands still stained red. I looked down at Miller one last time. 23 years old, a carpenter's son from Pennsylvania. He'd carried a photograph of Sarah in his helmet liner, wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. He used to show it to anyone who'd listen. 'That's the girl I'm gonna marry,' he'd say, grinning like the war couldn't touch him. I bent down and took the photograph from his pocket. It was still warm. Kovac grabbed my shoulder. 'Hayes, now.' I followed him into the snow. The woods outside Bastogne were a nightmare painted in white and black. Trees shattered by shells stood like broken teeth against the sky. The ground was frozen so hard our boots barely left prints. We moved in a line, rifles ready, breath misting in the air. Every sound was a threat. Every shadow could be the enemy. We'd been surrounded for days. Cut off from supply lines, from reinforcements, from hope. The cold was killing as many men as the Germans. Frostbite turned fingers black. Dysentery hollowed us out. But we kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing the men beside you. I thought about Miller with every step, about the promise I'd made, about the lie I'd told. 'Hayes, you good?' It was Davis, a kid from Ohio who still had peach fuzz on his cheeks. He'd joined us 3 weeks ago, fresh-faced and eager. Now his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare we all carried. 'I'm good,' I lied. We dug in at the edge of a clearing, using fallen logs and frozen earth as cover. Kovac passed around what was left of our rations. Half a K-ration bar each. A sip of water from canteens we had to thaw over small fires. The cold made everything taste like metal. 'How long do you think we can hold?' Davis asked, his voice small. No one answered. We all knew. The Germans had superior numbers, better equipment, and the will of men who thought they were winning. We had stubbornness, and the memory of why we'd come here in the first place. I pulled Miller's photograph from my pocket and stared at Sarah's face in the fading light. She was smiling, dark curls framing her face, eyes that looked like they could hold the whole world. Miller had described their first date 100 times. A county fair, a Ferris wheel, her hand in his as they looked out over the lights. She laughed at all my terrible jokes, he'd said. That's when I knew. I folded the photograph carefully and put it back in my pocket. Maybe some promises aren't meant to be kept. Maybe some are meant to haunt you. The attack came at dusk. German voices shouting through the trees. The sharp crack of rifles. The whistle of incoming mortars. We returned fire. Muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like fireflies. The noise was deafening. A symphony of violence that drowned out thought, drowned out fear, drowned out everything except the need to survive the next second. I fired until my rifle burned hot in my hands. Beside me, Davis took a round to the shoulder and went down screaming. Kovac dragged him behind cover, cursing in a language I didn't recognize. The world became a blur of smoke and blood and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The Germans pulled back, melting into the trees like ghosts. We counted our losses. 3 dead, 5 wounded. Davis would live, but his war was over. I sat with my back against a tree, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't light a cigarette. Kovac sat beside me, his face carved from stone. "Miller?" he asked quietly. "Gone." He nodded. He didn't offer comfort. There was none to give. In war, death is just another weather pattern. You endure it. You don't question it, but I couldn't stop questioning. Why Miller? Why not me? What cosmic cruelty decided who lived and who became a memory wrapped in wax paper? Kovac pulled out a flask and took a long drink. He offered it to me. I took it. The whiskey burned, but it was the first warm thing I'd felt in days. You did what you could, he said. I shook my head. I promised him. We all make promises we can't keep. That's what makes us human. I wanted to believe him, but belief is a luxury men like us couldn't afford. So I sat in the snow and the dark, holding a dead man's photograph, wondering if silence was the only answer any of us would ever get. Morning came without mercy. The sun broke over the Ardennes, cold and pale, turning the snow into a blinding expanse that hurt to look at. We buried the dead in shallow graves marked with helmets on rifles. There were no words, no prayers, just the sound of frozen earth being scraped away, and the quiet understanding that tomorrow it might be us. I couldn't bury Miller. His body was still in that barn, and the Germans controlled the road between us and it. So I carried him in other ways, in the weight of his photograph, in the promise I'd failed to keep, in the silence that had replaced his voice. We moved south toward the town of Foy, where intelligence said the Germans were dug in deep. The march was brutal. Men collapsed from exhaustion and cold. We left them where they fell, because stopping meant dying for everyone. The morality of war isn't clean. It's a series of impossible choices wrapped in the thin justification of survival. Davis walked beside me, his arm in a makeshift sling, his face gray with pain. He should have been evacuated, but there was nowhere to evacuate to. So he kept walking. You knew Miller long? He asked. Since basic training. Fort Benning, summer of '42. Davis nodded, waiting for more. When I didn't offer it, he said, My brother died at Anzio. Never got to say goodbye. That's the part that gets me. Not that he's gone, but that I didn't get to. I don't know. Finish things. I understood. War leaves everything unfinished. Conversations cut short. Futures erased. Promises broken. He have someone back home? I asked. A wife. 2 kids. He used to write them every night, no matter how tired he was. I've got his last letter in my pack. Can't bring myself to read it. Maybe you're not supposed to. Davis looked at me, his young face trying to understand something too old for his years. Maybe, he said quietly. We reached the outskirts of Foy by midday. The town was a ruin. Buildings collapsed, streets cratered, the church steeple leaning like a drunk. Smoke rose from a dozen fires, mixing with the low clouds to create a gray haze that smelled of burning wood and cordite. Kovac gathered us in the shell of a bakery. 12 men left from the original platoon of 30. We looked like ghosts. Uniforms torn and stained. Eyes hollow. Hands that trembled even when we weren't cold. Intelligence says the Germans are using the town as a staging point, Kovac said, his voice flat. We hold this position until reinforcements arrive. If they arrive. And if they don't? Someone asked. Kovac didn't answer. He didn't need to. We spread out through the ruins, setting up defensive positions in buildings that barely stood. I took a spot on the second floor of what had once been a schoolhouse. The walls were pocked with bullet holes. Children's drawings still hung on one wall, faded and torn. A crayon sun, a stick figure family, a house with smoke curling from the chimney. I thought of Miller's Sarah, wondered if she knew yet. Wondered if anyone had told her that the man she loved was lying dead in a barn in Belgium, that the future they'd planned was now just a photograph slowly fading in a dead man's pocket. War doesn't kill cleanly. It kills in layers. First the body, then the dreams, then the people who loved them. The memories came whether I wanted them or not. Miller and I had met on the first day of basic training. He'd stuck out his hand with a grin that was too wide, too genuine for the world we were entering. James Miller, he'd said, but everyone calls me Jimmy. Robert Hayes, I'd replied, shaking his hand. Everyone calls me Hayes. We'd bunked next to each other for 3 months, survived the push-ups and the drills and the sergeants who screamed until their voices broke. Miller had been terrible at marksmanship, brilliant at navigation, and unfailingly optimistic in a way that should have been annoying, but somehow wasn't. "We're gonna win this war," he'd say, lying on his bunk at night staring at the ceiling. "We're gonna beat the Nazis, go home, and build the kind of world worth fighting for." After training, we'd shipped out together. Landed in England, crossed the Channel on D-Day, waded through water turned red with blood. We'd fought through hedgerows and villages, through summer heat and autumn rain. Through it all, Miller kept talking about Sarah, about the wedding they'd have, the house they'd build, the children they'd raise. "She's the reason I'm here," he'd said once, cleaning his rifle in a foxhole outside St. Lo. "If I die, at least. I die knowing I tried to make a world where she can be safe." "You're not going to die," I'd told him. "You don't know that. I promise." He'd laughed then, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Hayes." But I had. And now he was dead, and I was alive, and the world spun on, indifferent to both. The first German probe came at sunset. A squad moving through the ruins, testing our defenses. We let them get close, then opened fire. The firefight was brief and brutal. When it ended, 3 Germans lay dead in the street, and we'd lost one. More man, a quiet guy from Montana whose name I'd never learned. Kovac called me down to the bakery after dark. He had a map spread across a broken table, lit by a single candle. "We can't hold this position much longer," he said. "We're low on ammunition, low on men, low on everything except corpses." "What's the plan?" "There is no plan. We wait. We fight. We hope. And if hope runs out?" Kovac looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Then we die well. That's all we've got left." Back in the schoolhouse, I pulled out Miller's photograph again. In the candlelight, Sarah's face seemed to glow. I wondered what she was doing right now. Maybe working in a factory, building planes or shells. Maybe lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the absence of the man she loved like a hole in her chest. Davis appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Can't sleep," he said. "Me neither." He sat down beside me and we shared the silence, the only language soldiers really speak. After a while, he said, "Do you think it matters? What we're doing here?" I thought about all the men we'd lost, about Miller and his broken promises, about the children's drawings on the wall and the families who'd never come home. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think we have to believe it does. Otherwise, what's the point?" Davis nodded slowly. Then he pulled his brother's letter from his pocket, unfolded it with shaking hands, and began to read by the light of the moon filtering through the broken roof. I turned back to the window and watched the darkness, waiting for the next attack, knowing it would come. War doesn't ask if you're ready. It just comes. The cold intensified. The winter seemed personal now, like it had chosen us specifically to torment. Men lost toes to frostbite. Lips cracked and bled. We burned furniture for warmth, but the fires drew enemy attention, so mostly we just shivered and endured. The Germans attacked again at dawn, this time in force. Mortars rained down, turning the street into a crater-scarred wasteland. Machine gun fire raked the buildings. We fired back from windows and doorways, but we were slowly being pushed back, slowly being erased. I watched a man I didn't know take a bullet through the throat. He fell without a sound, his eyes wide with surprise, as if death had caught him off guard. "Maybe it always does. Fall back," Kovac screamed over the chaos. "Fall back to the church." We ran through smoke and rubble, dragging the wounded, leaving the dead. The church was the only building still mostly intact, a stone fortress in a landscape of destruction. We barricaded the doors with pews and debris, set up firing positions at the shattered windows. 8 of us left now. 8 men holding a church against an army. Davis was hit as we entered, a round through the leg that shattered his femur. He screamed, a raw animal sound that cut through even the gunfire. Kovac and I dragged him inside, pressed bandages against the wound that bled faster than we could stop it. "I'm done," Davis gasped, his face white as chalk. "I'm done." "You're not done," I said, tying the bandage tighter. But we both knew. Without a hospital, without proper care, he'd be dead by morning. He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The letter," he said. "My brother's letter. Don't let it end up in some archive. Send it to his wife. Promise me, another promise. Another weight I couldn't carry, I promise," I said. He smiled weakly. "You're a terrible liar, Hayes. The siege lasted 3 days. 3 days of gunfire and mortar strikes. 3 days of watching men die slowly from wounds we couldn't treat. 3 days of eating nothing and drinking snowmelt and wondering if this was how it would end. Trapped in a church in Belgium, forgotten by the world. On the second day, Davis died. Not from his wound, but from infection. It crept through his blood like poison, turning him feverish and delirious. In his final hours, he called for his mother, his voice high and thin like a child's. We held his hand and lied to him. Told him she was coming, told him everything would be all right. When he died, it was almost a relief. For him, at least. We buried him in the church basement, where the floor was dirt and we could dig without being shot. I took his brother's letter and added it to Miller's photograph. 2 ghosts I carried now, 2 promises I couldn't keep. Kovac found me sitting alone in the nave, staring at the ruined altar. The crucifix still hung above it, Christ frozen in his eternal agony, indifferent to ours. "You believe in God?" Kovac asked, sitting beside me. "I used to," I said, "before the war. And now? Now I think God went AWOL, left us to figure this out ourselves." Kovac laughed, a bitter sound. "Maybe. Or maybe this is exactly what we deserve." "I had a daughter," Kovac said suddenly. His voice was different now, softer, older. "Back in Poland. Before I escaped. She was 6 years old, dark hair like her mother. She used to climb into my lap and ask me to tell her stories." He paused, his hands trembling. "The Germans came to our village in 1939. I was away, buying supplies in the city. When I came back," he stopped, swallowed hard. "I came back to Ash." The silence stretched between us like a wound. "I'm not fighting for democracy," Kovac said. "I'm fighting because I need to hurt the men who took her from me, even if it kills me, especially if it kills me." I understood then. We were all carrying our dead, all fighting wars that had already been lost. "Miller had a girl," I said. "Sarah. I promised him I'd tell her he loved her, that he tried. But I don't know if I can." "You do," Kovac said. "Because someone needs to. Someone needs to tell her that his last thoughts were of her. That's the only kindness left to give." Maybe he was right. Maybe that's all war leaves us, small kindnesses in the ruins of everything else. On the 3rd day, the shelling stopped. Not because the Germans had given up, but because they were planning something worse. We waited in the church, rifles ready, knowing the final assault would come soon. It came at dusk. Shadows moving through shadows. We saw them closing in from all sides. "Here we go," Kovac said quietly. "Make every shot count. We open fire." The muzzle flashes lit up the church like lightning. Germans fell, but more kept coming. They reached the doors, began battering them down. We shot through the wood, heard screams, kept firing. A grenade came through a window. I dove behind a pew as it exploded, shrapnel tearing through the air. My ears rang, my vision blurred. When I looked up, half the men were down. Kovac was hit, shrapnel in his chest. He slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath him. I crawled to him, pressed my hands against the wound, but it was too deep, too wide. "Tell them," he gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "Tell them we held." "We're still holding," I said. He smiled. "Liar." Then he died, and I was alone in a church full of corpses with an army at the door. I picked up his rifle, my rifle, every rifle of every man who'd fallen. I moved to the center of the nave and waited. The doors burst open. Germans flooded in. I fired until the rifles clicked empty, then grabbed another, fired again. They fell, but more came. Always more. A bullet grazed my shoulder. Another hit my leg. I fell to my knees, still firing, still refusing to surrender. Then, through the haze of smoke and pain, I heard it. The distant rumble of engines, the sharp crack of American guns, reinforcements. Finally, the Germans heard it too. They hesitated, retreated, fled. And I collapsed on the floor of that church, surrounded by the dead, wondering if survival was a blessing or a curse. They found me 2 hours later. American medics, faces young and shocked, picking through the ruins of Foy. I was conscious, but barely. Blood loss and shock had turned the world into something abstract. "Jesus Christ," one of them whispered. "He's alive." They carried me on a stretcher through streets I'd helped destroy, past the schoolhouse, past the bakery, past the shallow graves. The field hospital was a circus tent pitched in a frozen field. Rows of wounded men on cots, nurses moving between them like angels in mud-stained uniforms. They cleaned my wounds, stitched me up, pumped me full of morphine until the pain became something distant. I slept for 2 days. When I woke, the war had moved on without me. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The Germans were in retreat, but I couldn't forget. Miller's photograph was still in my pocket, miraculously intact. Davis's letter, too. The nurse who inventoried my personal effects handed them back with a sad smile. "Someone you need to write to?" she asked. "Someone I need to face," I said. They shipped me back to England to recover. A hospital in Southampton with clean sheets and hot meals. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt like a ghost haunting the world of the living. At night, I dreamed of the church, of Kovac dying against the wall, of Davis calling for his mother, of Miller bleeding out in that barn. The dreams were so vivid I'd wake gasping, convinced I was still there. A chaplain came by one afternoon. "Young guy, probably never seen combat. God has a plan," he said. "Does he?" I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, his plan looks like chaos. The chaplain left without another word. Some truths are too heavy to soften. I received my discharge papers in March 1945. Honorable, Purple Heart, Bronze Star for conspicuous gallantry in the defense of Foy. The medals felt like lies, but I pinned them on anyway. The journey home took 3 weeks. A transport ship across the Atlantic, then a train from New York to Pennsylvania. Every mile felt like swimming through mud. I watched America pass outside the window. Cities that hadn't been bombed, people who smiled, children who played, and felt like an alien. Miller's hometown was called Harrisburg, a mill town on the Susquehanna River, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. I found Sarah's address in Miller's letters, 1247 Pine Street, a small house with a white porch and a dogwood tree in the yard. I stood across the street for an hour, trying to find the courage to knock. A woman came out to water the flowers. She was exactly as Miller had described. Dark curls, eyes that held the world. She wore a simple dress and an apron. And for a moment she looked so normal, so untouched by the war, that I almost turned away, but then I saw it, the gold star in her window. She already knew. I crossed the street before I could change my mind. She looked up as I approached. Her smile faded. She knew what I was before I said a word. "Mrs. Miller?" I asked. "I'm not Mrs. Miller," she said softly. "We never got married. I'm Sarah Bennett, but I suppose I was going to be. I'm Robert Hayes. I served with Jimmy. I was with him when—" My voice broke. She set down the watering can. "Come inside." Her living room was a shrine to a future that would never exist. Wedding magazines on the coffee table, fabric swatches, a half-finished guest list. She saw me looking and said, "I can't bring myself to throw them away. Isn't that foolish?" "No," I said. "It's not foolish." She made tea with trembling hands. We sat across from each other, the silence heavy. Finally, she asked, "Did he suffer?" I thought of Miller's labored breathing, his broken whisper, the light leaving his eyes. "No," I lied. "It was quick." She nodded, knowing I was lying, grateful for it anyway. "They sent me a telegram. That's all. We regret to inform you." No details. Nothing about who he was or why it mattered. I pulled the photograph from my pocket. He carried this every day. His last words were about you. Her hands shook as she took it. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't sob. Just a quiet weeping like rain. "He said to tell you he loved you," I continued. "He said to tell you he tried." "Tried for what?" "To make a world where you could be safe, where you could be happy. That's why he fought." She held the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. "I waited," she whispered. "Every day I waited. I built an entire future in my head and now it's just gone." "I promised him I'd tell you," I said. "That's the only thing I could give him." She looked at me then, really looked at me. "Why did you survive and he didn't?" It was the question I'd been asking myself every night. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She reached across and took my hand. "Don't be sorry for living," she said. "Be sorry if you waste it." We sat like that for a long time, two strangers bound by the ghost of a man we'd both loved. I stayed in Harrisburg for 3 days. Sarah insisted. "You knew him," she said. "You're the only person left who really knew him. Tell me stories," so I did. I told her about Miller's terrible aim on the rifle range, about how he could navigate by stars but got lost walking to the mess hall. I told her about the time he traded his cigarettes for a harmonica and learned to play "You Are My Sunshine" because it reminded him of her. I gave her the edited version, the version that let her sleep at night. On the 3rd day, she asked, "What will you do now?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Go home. Figure out how to be a person again. Do you have someone? Someone waiting?" I shook my head. "I had a girl once, but that was before. I'm not the same man she knew." Sarah nodded. "The war took more than it killed," she said. "It took all the people we used to be." She walked me to the bus station. Before I left, she pressed something into my hand, a small wooden cross, hand-carved. Jimmy made this when he was 16. I want you to have it, to remember that he was more than a soldier. He was a boy who carved crosses and dreamed of building houses and believed the world could be good. I closed my fingers around it. Thank you. No, she said. Thank you for bringing him home the only way you could. The bus pulled away, and I watched her shrink in the window. A woman in a simple dress, standing alone, waving goodbye to a ghost. I went home to Ohio, to a house that felt too big and too empty. My parents were there, older than I remembered, worn down by worry. They hugged me and cried and asked questions I couldn't answer. I tried to adjust. Got a job at a factory making car parts. Spent my days surrounded by noise and routine. At night, I sat on the porch and smoked cigarettes, watching stars that looked nothing like the ones I'd seen in Belgium. Months passed. VE Day came. Celebrations in the streets, parades, kissing couples. I stood on the sidewalk watching it all, feeling nothing. Miller was still dead. Kovacs was still dead. Davis was still dead. The war might have ended, but their wars never would. I started writing letters. To Davis's sister-in-law, enclosing her husband's final letter. To Kovac's distant cousins in New York. To the families of men whose names I barely remembered, but whose faces still woke me at night. I wrote to Sarah, too. Short letters at first, just checking in. She wrote back. Long letters about her life, about the wedding dresses she'd donated, about the job teaching children to read. Slowly, through ink and paper, we built something. Not romance. Not friendship exactly. More like two survivors clinging to the same piece of driftwood. I'm planting a garden, she wrote once. Roses and lilies and daisies. All the flowers I'd planned for the wedding. Jimmy would have laughed, said I was being sentimental. But I think he'd understand. We plant things so something can grow in the ruins. I thought about that a lot. About growth in ruins. About small acts of defiance against the darkness. 1 year after the war ended, I received a package. Inside was a program from a memorial service in Harrisburg. They dedicated a plaque in the town square, a bronze marker listing the names of local boys who hadn't come home. Miller's name was there, etched in metal, made permanent. Sarah had enclosed a photograph too, her standing in front of the plaque, holding flowers. On the back she'd written, "He's remembered. He mattered. Thank you for making sure I knew that." I pinned the photograph to my wall, next to the wooden cross. Small reminders that even in the worst darkness, some light survives. I'm an old man now. The war is ancient history to most people, a chapter in textbooks. But for those of us who were there, it's still happening. Still playing out in dreams and silences. I visit Sarah sometimes. She never married. Neither did I. We have dinner twice a year, once on Miller's birthday, once on the anniversary of his death. We don't talk about the war much anymore. Mostly we talk about gardens and books and the way the world has changed. The letters from other families stopped coming years ago. Most of them have passed now. The generation that knew the war firsthand is disappearing. Soon there will be no one left who remembers. I keep the wooden cross in my pocket. Touch it sometimes when the memories get loud. A reminder that we were all more than soldiers. We were boys who carved things and told bad jokes and believed in futures that never came. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. They want me to say yes, want me to make it neat and meaningful. But the truth is messier. Miller died in a barn in Belgium, and maybe his death contributed to something. Or maybe it was just one more tragedy. Maybe both things are true. What I do know is this. He loved a girl named Sarah. He kept her photograph dry even when everything else was soaked in blood. And in his final moments, he thought of her. That has to matter. Sarah asked me to write this. Someone should know, she said. Someone should remember what it really cost. Not just the names on plaques, but the futures that died with them. So here it is. The story of a promise I made and couldn't keep. The story of a man who died believing in something better. Miller would be 98 now if he'd lived. I imagine him sometimes, gray-haired, surrounded by grandchildren. Building bookshelves in his garage, still terrible at measurements. I imagine him happy. It's a lie, of course. A pleasant fiction. But maybe that's what memory is for. Not to record what happened, but to carry what should have been. I carry him still. In the cross in my pocket. In the dreams that wake me at 3 a.m. In the way I plant flowers every spring. Roses and lilies and daisies. All the things that grow in ruins. Sarah and I planted a tree last year. A dogwood like the one in her yard. We planted it in the town square, next to the memorial plaque. For the future he wanted, she said. The tree is small now, fragile, but it's growing. Maybe that's all we can do. Plant things. Tell stories. Make sure that the dead aren't forgotten. Make sure that silence isn't the only answer. I'll die soon. The doctors are polite about it, but I can read between the lines. When I go, I want Miller's photograph buried with me. And Davis's letter. And the list of names I've carried for 80 years. I want them close. Want them to know they weren't alone. Sarah will outlive me. Promise me something, she said last week, holding my hand. Promise me you'll rest. That you'll finally put down the weight. I wanted to promise her. Wanted to believe that death might bring peace. But I've learned not to make promises I can't keep. So instead I said, I'll try. She smiled. That's all Jimmy ever did. Try. That's all any of you did. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it is. Maybe trying has to be enough when keeping promises is impossible. Maybe showing up with a photograph and saying, he loved you, he tried, is the only victory available. Maybe planting trees and telling stories and refusing to let silence be the final word. Maybe that's the only way to honor the dead. Miller died believing the world could be better. And somewhere, an old soldier plants flowers every spring. And in Pennsylvania, a woman who never became Mrs. Miller teaches children to read, giving them the futures her own children never had. And maybe that small defiance against the darkness means something. Maybe it's not the promise I made, but maybe it's the promise I kept anyway. The war took everything from us. Our youth, our innocence, our futures. But it couldn't take the love. It couldn't take the memory. Miller loved Sarah. Sarah loved Miller. And that love survives, even when the people don't. Even when the promises break. That has to count for something. Because if it doesn't, if all those deaths mean nothing, then what was the point? So I choose to believe it matters. I choose to believe that somewhere, Miller knows that Sarah remembered him. That his story got told. I choose to believe because the alternative is unbearable. And maybe that's faith after all. Not the kind the chaplain tried to sell me, but faith that love persists. That memory matters. That the dead speak through us if we listen hard enough. So here's my question to you. Whoever you are, reading this or hearing this story, who would you still wait for, even if the world was burning? Who would you carry with you, even if it broke your heart? What promise would you try to keep, even knowing you'd fail? Because that's what it means to be human. Not succeeding, not winning, just trying. Just showing up with a photograph and saying they mattered, they loved, they tried. That's all we have. That's all we've ever had. And maybe, just maybe, it's enough. If this story touched something in you, if it made you remember someone you've lost, or think about promises you've made, share it. Let their memory live on. Let the silence have an answer, even if it's just this. They were here. They mattered. They tried. And so do you.